Hello and welcome to another session in question and answers here on SUZA TV. You're going to be with me, Munir Mustafa, on the subject of biology. Today's program is going to be a little bit special because today we're going to finish the Form 1 syllabus. So this session is going to be the final session for the Form 1 syllabus. Okay, without wasting any time, let's go on to our next session, in which we would, most of the time our topics would be classification, and mostly in kingdom Monera and Protoctista and viruses. So without further ado, let's start with the first question. Our first question says, define classification. Like most Form 1 questions, it's a common question in which the student is required to define what is classification. What does the term classification mean? In a simple language, to classify something is to place it in classes, that is, to place it in various groups. For example, in a class you can say, I'm going to classify you into tall people and short people. Things like that. That is classification in a broad term. But in biology, we say that classification is the grouping of organisms based on their similarities and differences. That is what classification is in terms of biology. That grouping an organism based on its similarities and differences with other organisms, that is what classification is. It means that in order to classify something, you just have to look at its differences and its similarities with other organisms. Moving on into question B, we're asked to state, why is classification important? And a question like this just requires a person to state the importances of classifying organisms. Why is it important that we have classification in biology? So in answering questions like this, you can answer it based on how you see it, or on what are the advantages of classification in answering a question like this. So looking at the advantages of classification, you can answer something like this. You can start by saying classification is important because, first of all, grouping organisms together makes it easier to study and identify. Meaning that if you group some certain organisms together, it can be very easy for you to identify them and to study them. For example, by placing lions and a house cat, cheetahs into the cat family, you can easily study and identify cats of the cat family. For instance, lions, tigers, cheetahs, leopards, and so on. They're all in the same family, the cat family. Also, due to the fact that classification gives each organism its special name, it makes it easier for scientists to identify organisms no matter which part of the world they are in. So, talking about the second one, it's that it makes it easier for scientists to identify them, in which scientists can identify the organisms based on their scientific name. For instance, the word dog or the word cat. In Kiswahili, the word cat is called paka. In English, we can call it a cat. In Japanese, we call it neko. In French, we call it chat. In Arabic, we call it qittu. So, if people used their own languages, it would be very hard for someone to know what they are talking about. So, but for instance, using a scientific name, for example, the scientific name of a cat is Felis catus. So, if you tell a scientist that you're all talking about studying the Felis catus in a certain region of the area of the world, then many scientists or all scientists of biology would know that you are talking about a common house cat. Also, classification enables scientists to make predictions. Based on classification, organisms are studied, and as organisms are studied in classification, it's easy for them to make predictions on who their ancestors or who the organism's ancestors were, or who are going to precede them, or who they are going to be ancestors of. For instance, by using classification, most scientists knew, or most scientists got the idea that reptiles are descended from dinosaurs. Or they can say that sharks are descended from a megalodon or ancient sharks, things like that. Also, in classification, another importance of classification is that it helps us make it easier to study organisms in a group. So grouping organisms together, which is classification, helps scientists and other people to study it easily. That is one of the importances of classification. So writing something like this can give you marks against the teacher. So when asked to write the importances of classification, you just have to look at what does classification help us to do. When we answer a question like that, then it can be easier to know what is required. Moving on to our second question, we have contrasts between artificial and natural classification. When asked a question like this, there is the word contrast. The word contrast actually means differentiate. So it's just a word, or the question is just saying that you should differentiate between natural classification and artificial classification. As in the introduction, we know that there are two types of classification, which are natural classification and artificial classification. So while differentiating them, we have to look at what characteristics does the natural classification have which are different from the artificial classification. So answering it, you can write it in a tabular form like this shown on the screen, or you can write it in a sentence way. So while looking at our answers, we can see that, for instance, natural classification. First, natural classification considers both internal and external features. So natural classification is mostly based on its internal and external features. So the internal features of an organism, its anatomy, and its external features, its physiology, are all required to be examined in order to group them in natural classification. In artificial classification, it's based on external features only, that is its physiology. For instance, bats, by using natural classification, we can group bats into the mammal group, but using artificial classification, we can group bats, bees, and birds together just because they have wings. Another characteristic of natural classification is that it requires advanced scientific skills. So a person should be very skilled in the art of classification or in the science of classification in order to perform natural classification of any organism. But on the other hand, artificial classification requires simple skills. It's just a person's observation. It's his external features or his external sense organs. For example, the sense of touch, the sense of hearing, the sense of sight. Using those senses can help a person to perform an artificial classification. Also, the natural classification is based on international standards. So there are certain standards internationally that help or that support or do not support the classification of some certain organisms. So there are certain standards in the international world. While in artificial classification, it's based on an individual's interest. So in artificial classification, it's just based on what does the person think about. Anything which the person thinks about the organisms can be accepted in artificial classification, but there are certain standards which must be met in natural classification. Also, it takes more time and money in natural classification. So natural classification basically uses a lot more time, as it needs extensive time for research and extensive money which help to buy equipments for research. While in artificial classification, it's usually fast and inexpensive. So what is required is only a person's work rate and his own time, as not much money is used. The only money used is for the person to go directly and observe the organism. That's the only money used. Also, it's more accurate. A natural classification is more accurate as it's extensively studied. It's extensively observed. The organisms are grouped based on a high level of observation. While in artificial classification, it's less accurate as it only depends on one person. So in the fifth one, or in the fifth difference, we can see that in natural classification, there are more than one person's opinion. So it's not easy to make mistakes, while more people use or give their opinions on how to classify the organism. While in artificial classification, it only needs a single person, so it's less accurate because we know that people tend to make mistakes. Moving ahead, we have our next question. To draw and label a paramecium and enumerate its characteristics. So a question like this is simple and straightforward. What is required simply is just to draw the paramecium. And what is a paramecium, you could ask? A paramecium is just an organism which is found in the kingdom Protoctist. It's in a kingdom Protoctist, and its phylum is phylum Apicomplexa. So looking in that, we can see that we should know what a paramecium looks like and how to draw it. So a student, while answering this question, should have in mind that what is required is to draw a well labeled diagram. As a diagram like this is shown, we can see that this diagram is large, it's very well labeled, and it shows the various important parts of the organism. For instance, there is the cilia, the contractile vacuole. These parts are very important. The oral groove, the nucleus, the membrane, the anal pore, the food vacuole, and the nuclei, plus the pellicle. So these parts are very important in labeling the paramecium. So while labeling the paramecium, we should know that it should have, or it should be labeled like this, clearly, and it should be seen very clearly in order to get full marks. So this question actually should know it has two parts, as the first part tells us to draw and label it, while the second part tells us to enumerate its characteristics. So while drawing and labeling it is one part of the question, as we can see, it's drawn and labeled, but also while saying enumerate its characteristics, it just means that we have to mention the characteristics of the paramecium. So one of its characteristics says that it's unicellular and slipper shaped. We should know that as a member of the phylum Prototists or the kingdom Prototists, it's unicellular, so it's a eukaryotic cell. We can see that from the diagram that it's a eukaryotic cell, and also that it's slipper shaped. So we can see that the shape of a paramecium is like a slipper or a shoe. We can see that. So one characteristic mentioned is its shape and its nature. So its nature is that it's a unicellular organism, plus its shape is like a slipper. That is one part. Another characteristic is that it is heterotrophic. And what is heterotrophic? We have said this many times in the beginning, that a heterotroph is an organism which feeds on other organisms in order to gain nutrients, while an autotroph is an organism which produces or makes its own food. So we can see that a paramecium, another characteristic of a paramecium is that it is heterotrophic. That is, it feeds on other organisms. Another one is that it lives in water. So hence the paramecium is aquatic. So we can know that its habitat, or where is it found. We can know that another characteristic of the paramecium, that it's found in water. So it's an aquatic organism. Another one is that it uses cilia to move and create a feeding current. So we can see that, or we can know that a paramecium, due to its shape and due to its size, it uses cilia to move. As we know that cilia are hair-like extensions which extend from the cell membrane. So these hair-like extensions help the paramecium to move and also creates a feeding current. And what is a feeding current? A feeding current is just a current produced by the cilia in which it helps the food particles to enter in. Another one is that it uses cilia to move and create a feeding current. So we can see that, or we can know that a paramecium, due to its shape and due to its size, it uses cilia to move. As we know that cilia are hair-like extensions which extend from the cell membrane. So these hair-like extensions help the paramecium to move and also creates a feeding current. And what is a feeding current? A feeding current is just a current produced by the cilia in which it helps the food particles to enter in. Feeding current is. Another one is that its body is covered with a pellicle. The pellicle is just a hard outer cover, or it's a tough outer cover which protects the cell from either being ingested by other organisms, that is being destroyed by the digestive juices. Also, the pellicle serves as a shield to protect it from either osmosis or other things. So in all, the pellicle is a shield, or it's a protective cover which covers the paramecium. Another question is that, or another question asked is, viruses are said to be living, yet they are also said to be non-living. Show the characteristics of viruses. As we said before, that in this topic or in this certain session, we would also talk about viruses. A question based on viruses. So here's the question. It says that viruses are said to be living, yet non-living. As we all know, viruses have certain characteristics which are both living and non-living. So when asked a question like this, first is a statement which gives you an insight on the question asked. So when asked a question like this, it should tell you that what is needed is the characteristics of viruses. And in the second part, in this question, the question comes directly, as you are required to show the characteristics of viruses. The first characteristics of a virus is it has a simple structure consisting of genetic material within a protein shell. A virus has a very relatively simple structure in which it consists of only a genetic material, which is either DNA or RNA, but not both. So we should know that a virus cannot contain both DNA or RNA. It should contain either RNA or DNA only. And it is protected by a certain shell made up of protein which the shell is known as capsid. So the capsid protects the genetic material of the virus. A virus cannot reproduce on its own. So this shows a non-living characteristic, as it cannot reproduce on its own. So a virus must be a host to be able to reproduce. This is also known as obligate parasitism, in which the virus shows that when outside a host cell, it is dormant, or it is like a non-living organism, as it does not reproduce. But once inside the organism, or once inside the host cell, the virus starts to replicate, it starts to reproduce, showing signs of a living organism. So this sort of thing is known as obligate parasitism, in which the obligate parasitism just means it's a complete or total parasite, that it cannot live or it cannot perform any functions outside the host cell. So that is one characteristic of a virus. Another one is that they do not grow, feed, excrete, or respire. They do not show signs of living organisms, as they cannot grow. They do not grow, they are the same size. They do not feed, as they do not need any food, as they are made up of only genetic materials, but they do not have any organs, so they do not need to feed. Also, they do not excrete, as since they cannot feed, they cannot excrete. Or respire, they do not even need to respire, as they are only made to parasitize cells. So they do not need to respire at all. They do not need to feed, they do not need to excrete, or they do not even need to grow, as they need to be in a certain size to fit inside the host cell. Also, they are host specific. That is, a virus does not attack any cell or does not attack any host indiscriminately. They have certain hosts in which they attack. For instance, the HIV virus or human immunodeficiency virus is specific for humans only. So a cat cannot have HIV, a monkey cannot have HIV, a dog cannot have HIV. This is because the HIV virus cannot survive inside animals rather than a human being. So the HIV virus's host is specifically a human being. Also, there's the tobacco mosaic virus, which causes the tobacco mosaic disease in tobacco plants and things like that, and hosts like that. So the virus shows that it needs a specific host in order to continue its life cycle. Moving on to the fifth question,
In Kingdom Monera, its members are said to be beneficial and harmful to human beings. Show the validity of this statement. So, in this question, it said first that the Kingdom Monera, which consists of prokaryotes, that is bacteria, the members are said to be both beneficial and harmful to human beings. That is, there are advantages and disadvantages of Kingdom Monera to human beings. Show the validity of this statement. This statement on this question just requires you to state or to comment on it or to agree with it. But in reality, this question just needs you to show the advantages and disadvantages of Kingdom Monera to human beings. So while answering it, you can write it in a table like this. The advantages of Kingdom Monera. First of all, bacteria help to neutralize harmful substances which help to clean the environment. So there are some certain bacteria which neutralize toxic substances found in the environment so they clean it. So these bacteria are very beneficial to human beings as they can help detoxify the environment. In a disadvantage, bacteria can cause infections and diseases in animals. Some of the diseases are fatal. For instance, we have cholera and TB. We know that cholera and TB are caused by bacteria, and that these diseases are very harmful. They can cause death to human beings. So this is a disadvantage of Kingdom Monera, showing that they are very capable of killing even human beings through diseases and infections. Also, they help in digestion. There are some certain bacteria which are found in the digestive system which help to digest food. For instance, there are some certain bacteria which are found in the stomach of ruminants. These bacteria help to digest cellulose, which is found in plants or green materials, which are actually plant materials. So plant materials contain cellulose, which is also the constituent for the cell wall. Cellulose is a very tough constituent, or is a very tough substance, which needs to be digested. But in plants or in herbivores, these are helped to be digested by special bacteria which are found in ruminants. Also, this disadvantage cause food to spoil and decay. As you know, bacteria are decomposers. So, some saprophytic bacteria causes the food to spoil and decay, making it unfit for human consumption. That is, making it unfit for being eaten by humans. So some bacteria have this property. Also, nitrogen converting bacteria help to provide nutrients to plants. There are some bacteria which are found in the nodes of leguminous plants, which, for example, beans, peas, and so on, have the property of converting nitrogen from the atmosphere into nitrates. These nitrates are needed for the plant growth. Also, there are denitrifying bacteria which reduce the amount of nutrients available in the soil. So just like nitrifying bacteria which provides nitrates into the soil for plants to use, there are also denitrifying bacteria which reduce
the amount of nitrates in the soil, which reduce the nutrients in the soil. This causes harm to plants. So by writing a few disadvantages and advantages like this, a person or a student can answer a question based on Form 1. This marks the end of the Form 1 syllabus or answering questions on the Form 1 syllabus. I hope that you have had a good time and have understood on how to answer questions which come in various biology examinations just like this. Join us next time, as next time we're going to start with the Form 2 syllabus. I hope that we could meet again on that time. From me, Munir Mustafa, I'd like to thank you and for all those who have been listening to this Form 1 broadcast. Join us next time as we move on ahead to Form 2. You're all welcome and thank you.